How are you, Africa? Welcome to Pan-Africanism Through Poetry with Moses Tofa. Today's poem is titled, The Agonies and Reveries of a Pan-African Soul. Pan-Africanism played a key role in the liberation of Africa from colonialism. At independence, Africa was endowed with a crop of Pan-African presidents and intellectuals. These presidents took determined steps to unify Africa and liberate her from imperialism, and this made them to become victims of imperialistic missiles. They were either assassinated or deposed from power, and puppet regimes were enthroned. These include President Patrice Lumumba of the DRC, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Sylvanus Olympio of Togo, Modibo Keita of Mali, Benjamin Azikiwe of Nigeria, Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. The imperialists did everything possible to stop and reverse African unity. They fought to make sure that Africa will never be truly independent. They granted Africa independence under the diabolical condition that the guarantor of its stability is the maintenance of the colonial economic order. They imposed their template of governance on Africa. They made Africans to believe that Africa cannot do without them, to believe that they must aspire to be emptied of everything African and be repackaged with everything Western, and to believe that Pan-Africanism is a delusional enterprise. It is tragic that Africa has entered the most difficult age for Pan-Africanism, the most perilous age to be a Pan-Africanist. The age of African institutions that are not African. The age of African conversations and struggles that are funded and directed by imperialism. The age in which the worldview of Africans is primarily manufactured by the West. The age in which a brutally Pan-African soul can hardly be employed by African organizations because they are funded by the West so that they can toe the line of empire correctness. The age in which a brutally Pan-African soul cannot be employed by Western and international institutions because it is a disruptor of imperialism. The age in which imperialism has been repackaged in order to look outwardly appealing. The age in which imperialism has repackaged its imperialistic tools. Tools that masquerade as pillars of global virtue, but they are indeed inwardly ferocious. The age in which outwardly appealing concepts such as democracy, human rights, foreign direct investment, and free trade are essentially tools of imperialism. The age in which paying obeisance to imperialism is the definition of democracy, human rights, and constitutionalism in Africa. The age in which African elections are funded and directed by the East and the West. The age in which African elections are of more interest to Easterners and Westerners than they are to Africans. The age in which Pan-Africanism is used to protect vile governance by African leaders. The age in which Pan-Africanism is used as a smokescreen behind which to promote imperial interests in Africa. The age in which the imperialistic forces that seek to exploit Africa have multiplied exponentially. The age in which future African leaders are molded by imperialistic potters. The age in which the first enemy of a Pan-Africanist is a fellow African. The age of deep polarization and disunity among Africans. the age in which African intellectuals have strayed from the radar of consciousness and become egocentrically purposeful because they seek to be given royal entrance into the imperial edifice. The age in which consciousness has been supplanted by materialism and the burning desire to depart. The age of African leaders who have no grain of consciousness. It is indeed the most pessimistic age for Africa. Nonetheless, I choose to remain on the path of Pan-Africanism because only Pan-Africanism has the capacity to smash imperialism. It is the only gatekeeper that is capable of stopping imperialist forces from ransacking Africa's treasury. As long as the empire refuses to die, Pan-Africanism must refuse to die. I refuse to believe that there is no hope for Africa. I refuse to be dejected because in my Pan-African reveries, I traversed Africa and saw a new Africa. I saw an Africa whose resources benefit Africa. An Africa whose economy is fully restored to its rightful owners. An Africa whose land is in the hands of Africans. An Africa that is liberated from all colonial injustices. An Africa that is immunized from imperialism. An Africa that is no longer a hunting ground for imperialists. An Africa whose institutions are truly African. An Africa that is standing on the mountain top. An Africa that is respected by other civilizations. An Africa whose borders are symbolic. An Africa that allows Africans to cross borders without visas and passports. An Africa that allows goods to seamlessly flow from one end to the other. An Africa that is connected to each other through deluxe infrastructure and transport systems. An Africa with one currency, one army, one president, and one foreign policy advice. An Africa in which corruption is severely punished, if need be, by death sentence. An Africa whose young people are in positions of power. An Africa whose young people are no longer desiring to depart. An Africa whose young people are no longer perishing in the Mediterranean Sea. An Africa whose leaders see political leadership as an opportunity to serve and not to eat. An Africa in which constitutions are not amended to promote egocentric political interests. An Africa in which constitutions and constitutionalism dwell together. In an Africa that has no space for demigods. An Africa that is led by people with ideas. An Africa that is led by honorables that are truly honorable. An Africa that is led by unapologetic and brave revolutionaries. An Africa whose elections are free, fair, and credible. An Africa whose citizens think about the next generations and not about the next elections. An Africa whose citizens see their nations beyond individuals, groups, and political parties. An Africa that has no space for abductions, fear, and vile human rights abuses. An Africa whose politics is hygienic. An Africa that is free from inferiority complex. An Africa that believes in itself. An Africa that is proud of blackness. An Africa that does not aspire to be repackaged with whiteness. An Africa that owns the social, economic, and technological platforms that it uses. An Africa that attracts all Africans who are abroad to come back home. An Africa whose citizens converge on collective aspirations despite their political differences. An Africa with one voice and one direction. An Africa that is economically and militarily powerful. An Africa that is a nuclear power. An Africa whose education system produces employers and inventors and not servants. An Africa whose intellectuals have the firepower to expose and smash imperialism. I saw an Africa, I saw an Africa, I saw an Africa. I know that I will not live to see the Africa that I saw, but I desire to make my small contribution towards it. And I entreat all Africans of goodwill to make their small contribution towards it. Together, we will take Africa from reveries to reality. Thank you, Africa. This is Moses Tofa. Pan-Africanism through poetry. Inspiring Africa. Raising consciousness. Amandla.